Days of the month, we take time to look at a different hymn. And tonight, we'll do just that with the song that we just sang. Not a new song for anybody, but probably one that most of us would be familiar with. But we're going to look in three different ways at this song. And so, if you bear with me, the history teacher will come out of me just a little bit this evening, and I either apologize or I'm happy to do it, one or the other. Whatever you want to hear from me is how we'll look at it. But we'll talk about this song in three different parts this evening. From your earliest age, and I will say this, I have lived on a knife's edge all day, because when Kevin stood up for communion this morning, I thought he was dancing awful close to what I was going to talk about. And then when David May stepped up here to preach this morning, I thought he was dancing awful close to what I was going to talk about. And I was wondering where the breaker was to throw off the lights and the microphones and all that. But fortunately, we didn't have to use it. But if you hear anything that's repeated tonight, it's Thanksgiving weekend. And that's sometimes you just have to hear things a time or two more. But probably from your earliest age, you remember learning about the pilgrims at Thanksgiving, right? And you've got these images of the people with the black hats and the buckles. None of that was really accurate, but you have those images. They're what you have. A lot of what we learn about the pilgrims, if that's even the word that we want to use, and that was actually thrown on them much later as well, is probably inaccurate. It's a little bit legendary. It's a kind of an origin myth, as it were, of the country. But nonetheless, there is truth in the story that took place. And it's been 403 years ago, 1620, that a group of ordinary men and women, I think there were 102 people that came, landed on the shores of what would eventually be Plymouth Colony in Massachusetts. They came over on the ship, the Mayflower, met native groups as soon as they got here. Now, some people sometimes say, well, they're the first people to come here. That was not being right. So get that out of your head. There was numerous groups and people that had come before them, but they're like we said, sort of an origin myth, a shrouded legend, as it were. But they were coming from a place in England that had been a Roman Catholic country until 1534. So about 100 years before they came, their country had went through a huge sort of tumult. And King Henry VIII, for a few different reasons, had declared himself a new leader of a national church of England. And after he dies, a couple of his children were in charge for a period of time, but Elizabeth I, Queen Elizabeth, would be who you may be familiar with. She was his daughter, and she was the head of England as well. Even today, the King or Queen of England is considered the king or the head of the Church of England. But they made some changes within the church, but they kept a lot of the existing Roman Catholic sort of doctrines and activities, if we want to use that word, and practices is maybe a better word, in the English church. So these people that will come to America, they were looking for something different. They were calling for a return to a much more simpler way of worship, a less structured form of worship. In short, they desired, and stop me if you've heard this, they desired to return to worshiping in a way that the early Christians had done. These people were called Puritans because they wanted to purify the church. To purify something means to get it clean. I heard Dad telling a story this morning about when he was hiking on the Appalachian Trail. And one of the things that I've heard Dad talk about, and he's talked about with me a few times, is that you get nothing cold really to drink at all. You have to purify your water. And after you run it through the purification a time or two, it's not hot, but it's not cold either. But because you need it to be cleaned. Because if you take a big old drink out of that water that's in it could make you sick. So to purify, you want to clean something up. You want to get all the bad out of it. And that's what this group that came in part wanted to do. They wanted to purify the church. There was another group that wanted to separate completely from the church. Their name was pretty straightforward as well. They were called separatists. Nobody had to have creative names. But to separate or even to purify the church in England was an opinion that was illegal. And if you had that opinion, if you made that opinion known, you could be harassed, you could be fined, you could even be jailed for holding those religious beliefs. Eventually, those people left England and would find their way to America. Not long after that, the Puritans would take over in England, and they pretty much ruined things as well by making everybody do it their way with no other ways around it. All the things that they hated, they stuck upon themselves. But it was a bold step, but we can say that they made this step in order to glorify God in the way that they thought right. Let's jump forward 250 years. The song that we just sang is number 4 in your hymn book. I'd encourage you to take it out. You don't have to turn too far, but it's slightly different in the hymn book than the one that we sang right there. But the song that we sang is "To God Be the Glory." And this song was written a long time after those early pilgrims came to America, but a long time before me and you were born. It was written, or said to be written, because I think there's some debate about this, but it was written in 1875 by a woman named Fanny Crosby. You may remember it's been 2 or 3 months ago. We talked about her in one of these hymn lessons that we had. But the man that she worked with quite often was a man named Ira Sankey, a name that we've mentioned as well. And he incorporated this song into songbooks that people would use. But it never really took in America. For whatever reason, it just wasn't a real popular song. Sankey and Dwight Moody, who we talked about before, went on these trips to England to hold revivals in the late 1900s. They took this song with them, but even still, it didn't really take. It wasn't until Billy Graham in those crusades back in the 50s and 60s that this song became extremely popular to American churches and American audiences. Most of us have probably spent an entire life in the church singing this song. I can't remember ever not singing it, but it's not one that was really popular until much later. The woman that wrote it, we've talked about her quite a bit. She was blind at a very young age, but she began composing hymns when she was 6 years old. And you can flip through this book, or you can get another hymn book, and you'll find that she wrote a lot of songs. But most gospel songs center on Jesus. But this is the somewhat odder version in that this one directly addresses God and the great things he has done. The primary focus of God's actions is on the redemption of humanity, the redemption of you and me through who? Through Jesus, right? Through Jesus. The second line of the first stanza, if you've got your book, you'll see this. So loved he the world that he gave us his son. I'd say if there's any verses in the Bible that almost everybody here can quote, John 3:16 is one of them. For whatever reason, that's a Sunday school memory verse when we're young, and it just sort of flows through us. You should see some similarities there in the song that she wrote. So loved he the world that he gave us his son. In the second stanza, which may not be in your book, but it was what we sang up here just a moment ago, through referring to the promise of God, she's talking about Jesus, right? That promise that God's son would come and God's son would live and God's son would die for us. He would be, maybe you see this in the song, the perfect redemption, the purchase of blood. The third stanza again focuses on Christ, who is our wonder, our transport, and the one that we long to see in glory. Think about that for a second. Our transport. There are, some of you may know people that can't drive, or you maybe shouldn't drive, one or the other. But you know people that can't drive or shouldn't drive. Sometimes you know people that need a ride, right? And so we can be that transport for somebody because they need to get to the doctor's office. They they don't have a way to get there, and we can take them, right? Well, how is Jesus our transport? Well, we all need to get to heaven, but we don't have a way to get there. And so who is our driver, as it were? Who is our transport? Well, Jesus is the one that provides that way for us. And so when she wrote in this song, Our Wonder, Our Transport, Jesus is who that is. Few gospel songs express gratitude to God as a creator like this one. But that's what those pilgrims were looking for 400 years ago, the opportunity to glorify God. And that's what Fanny Crosby was writing about 200 or 150 years ago, the opportunity to glorify God. Well, what about today? How do I glorify God? Because I'm not a pilgrim. That time is coming and gone. I didn't know her because she's already gone. I'm living in this time. So how would I glorify God in 2023? Because I can't live in 1620 or 1875. Well, let's look at 3 ways that we could glorify God. We'll start with number 1. Glorify God through our faith. Let's think about this for a second. When we think about faith and what it is, we think about those pilgrims that we talked about a little bit ago. To go all the way across the ocean 400 years ago was about a month to 6 weeks journey on a wooden ship that was quite rickety, that was quite waterborne, that was very possible that due to outside circumstances or inside circumstances, that ship could sink to the bottom of the ocean. Now, how much faith would it take for you to get into one of those ships and go all the way across the ocean? Lucille has famously said that she will absolutely fly so long as they'll let her drag her foot on the ground in the airplane. I don't know that Lucille has a lot of faith in an airplane, but I'm not sure I'd have had a whole lot of faith in a big old clunky wooden ship out in the middle of the ocean 400 years ago either. But if you have the desire to do something different so much that you'll get in one of those ships and you'll go all the way across, that's an expression of faith. It was worth it to attempt that. Well, even today, we glorify God through our faith. Faith is the root of all of our good works. Let's think about this. 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18, 19, and 20. It's up here on the screen, at least the verse is. But as God is faithful, our word to you was not yes and no. This is Paul writing, by the way. For the Son of God, Jesus Christ, who was preached among you by us, he says, by me, by Silvanus, by Timothy, was not yes and no, but in him was yes. For all the promises of God in him are yes, and in him, amen, to the glory of God through us. What Paul is saying right here is there's not a yes or no, but in him, it has always been yes. Think about that for a second. You may have had somebody approach you with an idea. You may have had somebody approach you with an investment opportunity. They're asking you yes or no. Well, you have to sort of weigh the options there. Do I know this person? Yes, no. Can I trust this person? Yes, no. Does this idea make sense? Yes, no. Well, no is as good an answer as yes right there. But our faith in Jesus is the same as what Paul was saying right there. It was always yes, because we don't physically know Jesus. He lived at a time different from us. But Paul was writing to people who had never known Jesus either. But he said it was not a yes, no, but rather it was always a yes. That's faith, right? That's faith. That's a risk. That's a chance that we take. But it's through our faith that we glorify God. When we hear of God's promises, we glorify God because of those promises. Number 2, we glorify God by our worship. Over the last few Sunday mornings, when we've been talking about these Psalms, in the book of Psalms that have been gathered together over time, part of the reason for those Psalms was to give the people of that time an opportunity to worship God. They had an opportunity, as the New Testament says, to sing in songs and hymns and spiritual songs. Well, those psalms were a way that people back then, and we use that word kind of loosely, but back in the Old Testament times, would be able to glorify God. They didn't have the hymn book that you have in front of you, but they had those psalms. And we've been able to study them, and different presentations over the course of the last few weeks have said some of these psalms were told with a lot of cheer and a lot of joy, right? But some of those psalms were said with sadness. Some of those psalms were because of really bad things that had happened. Some of those things were, in a sense, sort of begging people, begging God for help. Ben talked a little bit about that in his psalm presentation this morning, and how that eventually those sons of Korah would be able to use that to be able to worship as well. Well, we glorify God through worship as well. But calling on his name with sincere hearts as an act of worship is one of those primary methods. Think about all the quote unquote religious things you do during the course of the week. A lot of them take place in this building. Let's think about for a second what they do. We can go in order, but one of the things that New Testament Christians assembled to worship to do was what we see in Acts chapter 12 and verse 5 and also verse 12, which was to pray. They would come together to pray. Think about all the reasons that you pray. Sometimes it's good, right? Sometimes it's bad. Sometimes it's worrisome. Sometimes it's celebratory. It's not different from what psalmists were doing 2,000-3,000 years ago, however long that was. They were doing the same thing. Well, one of our acts of worship is to pray. 2, when we worship, we sing, right? We sing. Every one of you sings. Think about it for a second. You may sing in this building. They say turn to number 4, and you turn to number 4 and you sing. But I'd say almost all of us sing outside of this building too, right? I've told the story before, but when I had first started mowing, I didn't really have any grasp of knowledge of how loud the lawnmower was. And my sister made fun of me because she would be outside hearing me sing while I was on the riding mower. Well, I didn't know that I was being that loud, but I could hear myself. But if you can hear yourself over top of a mower, you're probably singing pretty loud as well. Y'all have done that as well. You can look at me. Oh, y'all have sang on the mower too and sang pretty loud, right? Y'all have sang in the shower before, right? You have. And you've sang in the car. You've pulled up to that red light. You was belting out that song, and the person looked over at you and thought, that's a crazy person right there in the car beside you, right? But we like to say, there is a naturalness to us that sort of wants to pull singing out of us. That's a method of worship. Number 3, Colossians chapter 4 and verse 16, New Testament Christians assembled and assemble to preach, to teach. This is something that we're required to do, and something that sometimes has been put on the back burner in religious groups over the years. That's something, we're going to sing, we're going to work together. We're not too worried about the teaching part of it. But how can you grow if you don't learn anything from it? There has to be teaching. And better than that, there has to be preaching and teaching from multiple people so you can get perspectives and different ideas. We talked a couple of weeks ago about how Paul said that some of y'all was acting like Paul was the most important thing, and Apollos was the most important thing, and Peter was the most important thing. He said Christ is the most important thing, but we understand that multiple teachers can give you different perspectives on that. That's a requirement of worship. 4, each Sunday we come together, Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, we meet around this table. That's a requirement as well, because even though we're looking to move forward, we're taking Christianity into the future, we remember what happened in the past. We remember why it exists in the first place. This table is to gather around to remember the death of Jesus. Finally, 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 2, we also lay by in store, right? We see that in that verse that we give so that whether or not I'm here going forward, and there's no promise that any of us will be, but what I'm giving can help the church grow even if I'm not here to see that growth. We should honor God in all of our endeavors, but it's certainly in worship. We have to set aside the task, which isn't that hard, but our minds, which is a little harder whenever it's time to worship. Sing, study, pray, commune, preach. When we declare God's glory in worship, we're joining a long list of people who have done the same thing. Number 3, we glorify God through the work that we do, in all that we do. The New Testament clearly exhorts us to glorify God in our conduct. We've talked about that. But especially those things which strengthen the church. You know, we believe in Christ, we obey God, and we commit to works of service that bless the church. 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 10 and 11, got it shown up there. As each one has received a gift, minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. If anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. If anyone ministers, let him do it as with the ability which God supplies, that in all things God may be glorified through Jesus Christ, to whom belong the glory and the dominion forever and ever. Amen. Peter is saying in this handful of verses right here that whatever gift you have is a gift from God. Use it. Don't hide it under a bushel, right? The song, no, I'm going to let it shine. Whatever gift we have, we need to use it. The 2 verses prior to that, Peter commanded his readers to love one another, to be hospitable to one another. And so those are works as well. So whenever we are with fellow Christians, we need to work together. We need to be kind to one another. We need to love one another. But we need to take what we can do and use it. Because sometimes there are people that are capable of doing so much more, but they don't. And when they don't, it stunts the growth of other people as well. Well, if they can do more and they're not, why should I do more? But if I don't do more, then why should you? See, our example in the work that we do is to set an example for other people to see I can do so much more than I think I can do or that I even want to do. Because whenever we serve God, whatever we do, what's the song say? Whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord. Well, the same thing for us. And when I say, I can't do that, or worse, I'm not going to do that, what I'm really saying is not to me or to you or the person beside you, but to God. We'll let somebody else do it. If everybody here lets somebody else do it, won't get done. Faith in glorifying God comes from glorifying God in all that we do. It's our service to others, including fellow Christians. So we've read scripture this evening where the earliest Christians were encouraged to glorify God. We talked about people who 400 years ago went on a boat across an ocean into a wilderness to glorify God. We talked about a blind woman who wrote hymns to glorify God. And we've considered how the current or modern day Christian should glorify God as well. So the thing is, glorifying God has been a requirement from the start. And it will be a requirement until the end. And I'm not asking you to be Peter and Paul or to be the Pilgrims, Puritans, Separatists. or to be Fanny Crosby. We're just asking you to be you, but to be the best version of you, the version that does everything you can to make the church stronger, to make you a better Christian, but more than that, to make God and Jesus more known to any and every person that you come in contact with. That's the lesson for this evening. To God be the glory, great things he hath done. If there's anything we can do for you, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.
Zion skull sweetly rings over land and sea, giving us to